If there is one system in these games that is grossly outdated and in desperate need of a complete fundamental rework from the ground up, it's the online functionality of the Souls game.
This game is dead on PC. This game is absolutely dead. I have tried every level bracket. I have tried every single thing to do. I have tried in the early on in the day to record. I've tried later at night. I've tried at 2 a.m. I've tried at countless things.
Nobody co-ops in this game. Randomly. I don't know how many people have really noticed this, but the only place you find summon signs is right in front of boss fog. You are never going to just be like out in the open world and see a summon sign on the ground in the middle of nowhere and be like, oh cool, let's co-op here. And that is because of the systems they've designed around this just don't work for that.
Invaders typically are familiar with PvP, meaning that if it's a matchup between the host and the invader, usually the host is losing in this situation. To offset this, they decided to make it so that invaders can only invade multiplayer sessions. Makes sense, right? And I can absolutely see where they're coming from here. But the thing is, this is just another reason to not play multiplayer if you're not interested in PvP and just want to get through the game, like some people in Elden Ring do.
Because there's only 4 people allowed in any world, there's a lot less available fun things to do, in my opinion. The other big thing is that there's no covenants. There's no, there's no dark moons. There's no, swamp battles. There's no Pontiff's giant wars and stuff like that. There's just none of that stuff. Even fucking Bloodborne had a PvP area in the Nightmare area. So this is pretty much the first Souls game that just does not really have a dedicated PvP area. And I think that's a huge shame.
Why is it that invasions in Elden Ring feel so skillless? What makes invasions in Elden Ring feel so just hollow of happiness even when you are the one who won? What is it that makes it just such a supremely dissatisfying experience as of the current moment?
We are not doing high tier play here. We're largely just pretending to be idiots and just pew 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 pew. But you are seeing how hard this man has to work in order to avoid all of that. So even with these mobs, even with the terrain advantage, even with the skills that this guy is bringing to the table, which are good skills, he did a good effort and a good job, he just simply couldn't manage it. And that's absurd because he outplayed us by a factor of like 2, 3? That man deserved to win. But because the way that projectiles are organized, he had no chance.
Anyone can win that, and anyone can lose that. So it's like, it feels so bad because it's so easy to lose, yet it's so easy to win. It feels like so unrewarding, like no matter how you look at it.
There has been a plethora of video essays and critiques on Elden Ring in the landscape of the internet, covering various aspects of the game from world design, gameplay, lore, and prominently bosses. However, we're not focusing on those aspects for this video. Instead, this will focus on the multiplayer, specifically invasions, but also a little bit on co-op when applicable, and even the Colosseum later on. I wanted to take my time to settle my opinions on the multiplayer experience to see if FromSoft would add or improve the current systems, but after 2 years with the DLC releasing and many updates later, I've reached the point to where I can adequately share these thoughts. Elden Ring's multiplayer 2 years later, while progressing some aspects, is inarguably a regression from the games that came before. You may have heard this article detailing the origin and thought of multiplayer according to Miyazaki. He states, "The origin of that idea is actually due to a personal experience where a car suddenly stopped on a hillside after some heavy snow and started to slip. The car following me also got stuck, and then the one behind it spontaneously bumped into it and started pushing it up the hill. That's it. That's how everyone can get home. Then it was my turn, and everyone started pushing my car up the hill, and I managed to get home safely. But I couldn't stop the car to say thanks to the people who gave me a shove. I'd have just gotten stuck again if I'd stopped. On the way back home, I wondered whether the last person in the line had made it home, and thought that I would probably never meet the people who had helped me. I thought that maybe if we'd met in another place, we'd become friends. Or maybe we'd just fight. You could probably call it a connection of mutual assistance between transient people. Oddly, that incident will probably linger in my heart for a long time, simply because it's fleeting. I think it stays with you a lot longer, like the cherry blossoms we Japanese love so much. This is the basis that multiplayer can be observed not only in Elden Ring, but the other Soulsborne games as well. Due to them being smaller in scale and more linear than the open world design of Elden Ring, for its time, worked and was certainly unique. Rather than having a traditional menu with lobby details and level selection, it was handled in-game entirely through summoning another player, whether it be from a sign or beckoning bell. And that's what we have in Elden Ring, with some additions, that being effigies and summoning pools to make random multiplayer sessions easier to do in an area. While it is nice they accommodated the general way of summoning players, they did not improve the way sessions actually are. For players on PC, it's nice that they have the seamless co-op mod to enable an alternative experience for them. However, for console players such as myself, we don't have that luxury, which is a shame too, because a good co-op experience keeps people playing together, which if you're an invader is exactly what you would want, since co-op enables invasions. I'm primarily an invader. I enjoy the PvE of these games a lot, but invading to me is the unique endless endgame that Soulsborne offers, where you master all the combos, healing, and punish windows for enemies and bosses. What about another player? How about a group of players who have all the access to the weaponry you do, achieved what you have, and gone through the same in-game challenges as you? One important thing you have though is the way you play, your skill. Pitting that against one or more players is one of the aspects that is enjoyable in Invasions, but not the only one. You don't have to play directly as a bloodthirsty invader. While the game sets a goal for you, that being to defeat the host, the way you personally enjoy it is up to you. The feeling of using your built weapons, spells, ashes of war, and tools are fun to use against the PvE, but landing some of those really interesting attacks on another thinking player like you is something you cannot get from mobs. One of the other great things about Invasions is it not being entirely localized to a controlled area that's meant to facilitate PvP. It can happen almost anywhere provided a host world is open, which can provide interesting scenarios separate from one another with factors like level layout, enemies, verticality, and so on. Now, majority of what I've mentioned is present in past Soulsborne games, but now I want to talk about what makes Invasions in Elden Ring less enjoyable than its predecessors. Elden Ring multiplayer sessions have a limit of 4 players. Coming from Dark Souls 3 having a maximum of 6, 2 players being absent initially may seem arbitrary, but the ripple effect of this is more than just a simple reduction. For one, fight clubs aren't really a thing anymore, since it's much more of a hassle with the lower limit. If you think fight clubs are insignificant, while they may not be everyone's favorite activity, this was one of the routes that players, whether inexperienced or not, participated in. Through that activity, a player would get a sliver of PvP, which could interest hesitant players to continue engaging with it, or be the gateway/beginning into being an experienced player in PvP. Now though, that's not something that can easily happen anymore. The second is that the home team and Invader are missing an additional player for PvP. Of course, who wouldn't want more players to be present in a session? More the merrier, as they say, but now the host can only have 2 cooperators or hunters and 1 invader in majority of scenarios, and personally, even in Dark Souls 3, I found 1v3s to be tougher than most scenarios in that game, because at least with a 4v1, you are likely to get an invader to at least help even the odds depending on their skill level, but you will get no such help in Elden Ring. And it's unfortunately at the co-opper's expense too, because a typical invader is going to know this fact and play more passive otherwise, because even against inexperienced players in a 1v3 can be a very risky gamble due to the myriad of things in the game. If an invader doesn't want to engage the party because of the 1v3, and co-oppers don't want to engage because there's an invader waiting in the level, it turns into a waiting game, and that's not enjoyable for anyone. This isn't always the case, of course, since we do have long-range projectiles and weapons to harass enemies from afar until eventually someone engages, but it is something that can be helped with having an additional player on both sides to reduce passivity. Third is Taunter's Tongue runs. Much like the issue with fight clubs in Elden Ring, the lower player limit makes it less thrilling than what it should otherwise be, especially if you came from Dark Souls 3 dried finger runs with the chaos that a 4v2 could bring. Now it essentially becomes a regular invasion, with the possibility of a second invader. But even then, a 2v2 just isn't as fun because through the act of just being exposed to PvP for longer and engaging with it, invaders are more experienced than the average co-opper. Oftentimes you won't even need a second invader in a Taunter's Tongue world due to that. I'll touch upon Taunter's Tongue later on, but I hope that this shows some of the problems with less players in a world. Whether it be limitation due to last gen performance or another, it would not be such a notable regression had we not already had it in previous Soulsborne games. We have the largest game in Soulsborne, but a small player limit to enjoy it with others. Covenants were a way of allowing players to align themselves to a faction, and majority would allow different rewards or mechanics to engage with. Not only that, it provided a role-playing element that others could usually identify when in a multiplayer session. And while you could argue of how much of an impact they really had, FromSoft could have improved on the foundation and ideas they themselves made and improved them in their largest game yet. We have so many different ideologies and potential that Covenants could make use of here. I also love that Covenants in the past would be a route to multiplayer in many instances like old school forest hunting, grave lording, rat king, bellkeepers, watchdogs, eldritch faithfuls to name a few. Some of them gave different multiplayer scenarios such as my favorite in all of the games, Gravelording, which would make New Game Plus players in the area receive Black Phantom versions of enemies in unique places and would make you public enemy number 1 as you left a sign for others to invade you as a team to stop these enemies from appearing in their world. Back in Dark Souls 1 Remastered, with the upper player limit, it was some of the most fun I've had. It wasn't perfect, but it worked well and it was, dare I say, fun. Not having them in Elden Ring isn't the worst offense, but the mechanic could have fit so perfectly, and I can't help but just imagine how it could have been implemented to diversify multiplayer interactions. I even created this mock-up of a what-if Covenant graphic to illustrate this concept. Of course, nothing to be taken too considerably, but I wanted to show an example of different scenarios a player could engage with just like its predecessors. Some of these would really need the player limit to be increased though, to be the best it could be, as evidenced in the past. I do not know what went so horribly wrong in the making of the Taunter's Tongue to be the way it is, especially coming from Dark Souls 3's Dried Finger. We touched upon the lower player limit hindering the potential for the item, but it does have other issues as well. Just like the Dried Finger, it causes invaders to arrive very frequently, and allows the chance for a second invader to happen. That's where the similarities end. In Elden Ring, the Taunter's Tongue allows a solo host to open their world to invaders, since normally if playing alone, you can't get invaded otherwise, which is a compromise amidst the discussion of whether or not invasions should be enforced or optional for solo hosts. The strange design decision about Taunter's Tongue is that the host at any point can choose simply to turn it off. The main question is, why? Why would it work that way? This only enables ill-mannered players from abusing its function to gank, stream snipe, or funnel invaders. Once they have what they need or want to deny backup for the invader in their world, just boop, off. And for reference, Dried Finger would only wear off when you died or reloaded the area. To add insult to injury, they can have hunters enter their world to fill up any open slots if an invader defeats any cooperators. And yes, 100% the invader deserves to be at a disadvantage, even multiple during an invasion. But can it really be considered an invasion if the host and friends are looking for invaders to enter their world and have hunters come to their aid? Taunter's Tongue doesn't enable a reward for enabling it, so that would really be its only purpose. And that purpose is for enabling solo host invasions, which is flawed as well. If you as a host decide to use it because you want to be invaded, it only keeps the quirk of shortening the interval between invaders appearing, so once you defeat an invader, you can be sure that another will arrive shortly after. Instead of it being a unique occurrence that you would have to be wary of every now and again, you only have the extreme of constant invaders. There is no incentive for using this item for the regular player going through the game. Dried Finger did have an incentive because it would enable a third cooperator for the host, but it also came with the risk of enabling a second invader to keep it balanced. So let's talk about the actual issues you will likely come across in Invasions. You thought issues ended with the changes to the systems, but there's a myriad in actual sessions, and if you are an invader or tried it, you will likely already know these, but let's just go ahead and go over them. For one, spawning. Yes, an issue you can encounter the second you enter a session is spawning far away from the host party. It seems as though the spawning system takes into account the horizontal distance between you and the host, and spawns you accordingly, but it does not use the vertical distance as a factor. My favorite examples are Castle Morn, Caria Manor, and especially Mount Gelmir. While we do have Phantom Bloody Fingers to respawn, there's a very high chance you will spawn in the exact same spot, or another spawn that's still too far away. And we only get 3 of them, unfortunately, so once you lose them, it's tough luck, and your 2 options are to sever out or pray the party doesn't make it to a boss as you run a marathon. Speaking of running a marathon, whether an invader or co-opper in open world invasions, you will often find yourself running marathons running to or away from the enemy. A lot of the times, both parties will run, and because of the openness of the level, you often cannot corner and engage an opponent if they decide not to, and sprint in the miles of open field. The open world also not only strengthens projectiles because they are seldom covered to use, but also because you cannot use level layout to kite or separate a host party as effectively as a legacy dungeon in most scenarios. As an invader, there is seldom PvE support in these fields, let alone good support that can last long enough to make any meaningful impact or get any heat off your back on a 3v1, so running is very much encouraged, if not mandatory. It's annoying for co-oppers because the invader can run into the fields with any potential mobs and be relatively safe, and it's annoying for invaders because the host can stall for a summon or hunter as they run. No one is having any fun doing any of this unless they're deliberately trolling, and yes, it's not like these issues can't apply to legacy dungeon invasions, however the issues are exasperated in the open world. So I mentioned projectiles and how open world strengthens them. However, in general, you will often encounter opponents who use projectiles due to their strength and the sheer amount of them in different forms. We have sorcery, incantations, items, tools, weapons, and Ashes of War, each having its own share in what can be treated as a ranged attack. Some are stronger than others, but generally if you want to inflict damage from far away, you can. While in PvE, it could be considered welcome that they introduce ranged options being very accessible, desirable, and competent. In invasions, it can be a nightmare. One very important aspect is that the lock-on distance for targets has been drastically increased compared to how it used to be. It makes sense because of the size of the game. Well, this also means that enemies will be able to stay locked on and be able to chuck projectiles at you from a football field distance over. The tracking on most spells also aren't something to sneeze at either. Heck, anyone remember pre-patch Stars of Ruin or even Star Shower of today? Those are just 2 spells in a category, but a lot of these spells will often force a roll out of you, which means that any other opponents can gain ground against you. But mages chucking magic is nothing new. Though we have Ashes of War, and now things get a bit more challenging because there are a myriad of ranged attacks that a player can use on their weapons. And they're powerful if not oppressive. Beast Roar, Thunderbolt, and Stormblade to name a few. That's not mentioning other ranged Ashes of War belonging to unique weapons like Reduvia's Bloodblade, Miquella's Ring of Light, Wave of Gold, and Moonveil's Transient Moonlight. One-on-one, they're manageable, but in a gonk or gank, even one unexperienced player can make it hard. 2 or 3 players using those, and that's easily 18 inches of Mesmere. Ashes of War are a bit of contention personally because they are such a good option to use in majority of multiplayer sessions to where a player does not have to interact as hard or thoroughly otherwise if they were using their weapons kit. In other words, Ashes of War are so strong that it makes other attacks not as desirable. And notice my word usage there, desirable. There are a lot of good attacks and weapon classes and outliers in them that are extremely viable. But when you have a powerful customizable move that exceeds a lot of normal weapon attacks, a player is going to be inclined to use it if not downright spam it, because it works 95% of the time. This issue isn't entirely exclusive to multiplayer either, as a whole discussion could be made at how it can apply to the challenge in PvE as well. Coming from Dark Souls 3's weapon arts, I understand that they wanted to make Ashes of War desirable and powerful in Elden Ring, and I would say that they accomplished that for better or worse. Now, some of you that play at higher rune levels won't feel this issue as much, as it's more impactful the lower you go, but that is overleveled summons, which is exactly how it sounds, an overleveled summon that is in the host session. They do get downscaled to be congruent with the host level, but if you've played Elden Ring below meta, you probably already know that the downscaling system is not the best. Yes, they have decreased HP, FP, stamina, and questionable damage and defense adjustment, but they still have all their armor, weapons, spells, Ashes of War, etc. And status effect buildup from overleveleds, at least from my experience, does not seem downscaled at all. On top of lower status resists playing at lower level, an invader will have a status proc on them very quickly. If you are up against one, they don't even have an indicator telling you that they're downscaled, so you won't know until you're engaging with them. Granted, majority will be wearing or using late game gear, so you could tell that way, but that's important information the game should be showing. This mechanic comes with two downsides in my eyes. One is that overleveled phantoms trivialize the game's difficulty so much, more so than regular summons, and two, it's another reason on the list for invaders to seek stronger gear to further level the playing field, so to speak. Regular co-opers who encounter those invaders using strong gear may decide to do the same, and the arms race to the bottom continues. I think there is good in this mechanic in allowing higher leveled players not having to go through Elden Ring again to play with their friends, since the game is absolutely massive. But let's talk about the open world of Elden Ring in relation to progressing through it with the intent of building a character. Elden Ring is pretty huge, we know this. When going through it initially, I'm sure like most, we all enjoyed the exploration and many things to see and do. As I replayed a couple of times and decided to make different characters, I quickly realized something very early on is that making a build in Elden Ring takes a long time. Let me clarify what a build means to me, because I want to be as clear as possible. A build is the stats, armor, weapons, spells, talismans, consumables, Ashes of War a player has decided for their character, and it taking a long time is an understatement. It's not a problem inherently, it's just the way the game is. And with that in mind, it can be daunting to create another character and go through the game again. Some may say, well, Derpy, that's why the game gives such a high amount of larval tiers to change your build so you don't have to start a new character. While larval tiers are welcome, they don't adjust starting class, choices made in a playthrough, and the rune and weapon level a player decides upon. But even with larval tiers, there is another time investment a player needs to consider with some of their builds, which is getting materials for consumables. Whether a knight, warrior, sorcerer, or a cleric, you will also be a farmer, because in order to use a lot of the worthwhile consumables, you will need to spend time farming materials to craft them or farming items to drop. Thankfully, this farming issue can be mostly sidestepped entirely through another player dropping or duping materials and items, which just saves time. And it gets more scarce the older you get, man. And there is an argument I have seen of duping being wrong by some players. And you may have your opinion, but at the end of the day, it is not fun or engaging having to acquire these items. If you are younger and have an abundance of free time, or you are someone who has an inclination to play for building an audience or for monetary reason, then hey, you are blessed. But not everyone has the time or desire to farm all day when we have jobs, people, and other responsibilities we need to tend to. The Colosseum was added in patch 1.08 in December 2022 to facilitate PvP in a dedicated space with 3 maps, 3 game modes with the addition of using Spirit Ashes for some, and a password matchmaking system to organize matches between friends or opponents. If you're familiar with Dark Souls 3's arena, it's very similar, but let's talk about some quirks. First, the 3 maps to play on are very similar, with Caelid having one unique trait, which is the 4 pillars in the middle, but otherwise, they are huge, circular arenas that players will fight in. Compared to previous iterations of Arena, there was at least some variance among the maps, whether it be layout or atmosphere, but in Elden Ring, it feels like playing the same exact map with slightly different colored skies. Personally, I find the arenas way too large for anything other than 3v3s. If you wanted to corner or push your opponent back against the wall as an advantage for aggressing, you won't be able to, due to the sheer size. I imagine if you are a caster or use ranged projectiles, You will love the endless amount of space you can utilize, and if you are a melee player, you got some ground to cover if you solely prefer that playstyle. We're stuck with these maps, at least at the time of this video, but it's unfortunate we couldn't have more interesting arenas to fight in than a giant circle. It's funny to think back to Dark Souls 3 arenas and remember how many players wanted a flat arena to fight in. But the difference is that all of Elden Ring's maps are not only flat circular arenas, but they're the exact same. The maps do not have to be extravagant or complex, but some difference in layout and such would be a nice change of pace. Maps aren't only the critical aspect, as the system that the game uses to match people has not improved either. The barrier to interact with the Colosseum should be easy to get past so more matches can occur, but the way it is now is questionable. Having mode and map selection seems good, but what it causes is splintering of the player base with separate queues, which is already splintered further in tandem with the rune and weapon level matchmaking. Needless to say, it can be improved. Having an easier opportunity to have players match together, especially as the game gets older, is important for players that want to engage with this mechanic even years later. Besides the organized PvP with the option of spirit summons in 6 players, there is not much of an incentive to play Colosseum if you're an average player, less so if you dislike how the PvP is. Even if someone enjoys the Colosseum, the reward is really just ranks, which don't even show up outside the Colosseum. I will touch back on Colosseums later, as I believe they could be expanded upon and fix a lot of in-game issues in an organic way. So we have gone over issues with invasions and elements involved, but what could be improved? Well, patches that do balance changes are always welcome to improve how PvP may play, but balance changes can only go so far when the foundation, the multiplayer systems, are not given attention. We are now going to go over how aspects in the multiplayer could be improved, which some are apparent, but others I want to propose. I don't believe there are solutions that everyone will universally love, but I will present and give reasons as to why they would be beneficial. So I want to ask you, the viewer, to take a moment and think of how often you use rune arcs and great runes and how useful they are to you. I would guess that you probably do not or rarely utilize them because they're not relevant to the average player all that much. And it's not because they're bad, as great runes do have strong buffs and utility, but Dark Souls 3's equivalent, Embers, were desirable to use because on top of the 30% HP increase, you would also enable multiplayer to occur if you were online. It also helped that after defeating a boss, you would automatically receive the Embered buff, not only serving as a reward, but also reminding the player of the mechanic's existence. We come to Elden Ring, and after defeating a boss, you don't even receive a rune arc nor a great rune activation. I am not sure what the reasoning is, but the infrequency you gain them when playing the game offline compared to Embers of the previous game is a questionable design decision at best. It seems as though the scarcity was to encourage the player to participate in the multiplayer, as it's one of the more consistent ways of earning rune arcs. Though as a co-opper or invader, you cannot use great runes in any capacity besides the Phantom Great Rune from Mohg. When you accomplish your goal, whether it be by defeating a boss or defeating a host respectively, you are rewarded a rune arc which is only useful in your own world, which is similar to Embers in Dark Souls 3. But with the mechanic that allows for a variety of buffs versus just an increase in HP, why not allow it to have more of a presence if this is how Elden Ring wants to go about its availability and obtainability? We have 6 great runes that all players could be benefiting from and diversify build making even further, especially when playing with or against one another. I am fully aware that this suggestion could present problems maybe not considered as often with things on paper can be, but I would prefer having great runes be active during multiplayer, and there's reasons as to why. 1. It would make rune arcs more desirable to collect and activate due to great runes being able to be used in multiplayer, which works in tandem with rune arcs being rewarded at the end of a player's goal. 2. It would add more variety to players' builds when in multiplayer. Examples being Radahn's rune increasing HP, FP, and stamina, the similar Bloodborne rally mechanic with Melania's rune, or Godric's rune increasing all stats by 5. Having these enabled could remedy some PvP related cons such as Morgoth's rune, alleviating some of the absolute insane damage in multiplayer sessions by giving more HP to players. 3. It would make multiplayer sessions more desirable as a reward directly benefits you while you're in those sessions. I also want to suggest a rune arc shop, I'm sure some of you watching are waiting for that to come up, But yeah, a rune arc shop that sells some of those really time-consuming armor, weapons, and items that you have to either farm or craft would just be a good addition to the game as a compromise, so a player could spend rune arcs to get items like golem arrows, or go through the mental anguish that farming items like it can be. The less incentive given to players wanting to dupe by making a reasonable alternative to gain these things, the better. This one change would go miles in making the value of rune arcs exceptional. I personally like it because it benefits everyone in the game, from cooperators to invaders and duelists. As we go further along, for some of these changes, keep the rune arc shop in mind. Increased player limit is obvious. I think that out of any change, this would be the one everyone would like to see and the most impactful right away. Just to include more people into the mix could remedy some problems we've gone over in the beginning. For one, having more players in a session would be beneficial for both co-opers and invaders. Co-opers have their numbers advantage become stronger and get to play with more of their friends. And an invader hopefully gets a competent teammate that can be the solution to the lack of PvE support in a level and divides a gonk or gank's attention, which means less spam you have to dodge. If performance is an issue, having played Colosseum with 6 players on base PS4, while the load times when spawning would be longer in comparison to current gen consoles, I personally never noticed a drop in performance when playing, and I am assuming that was due to the lack of environmental or level related set pieces or effects in the Colosseum. With that in mind, I would firmly assert the player limit only be increased for legacy dungeons and similar areas since they usually have less going on, and exclude open world from this only if performance is an issue. Back in the day, it was really fun invading a tough group of 4 players that you've been struggling with, and then not only a second invader arrives, but there's someone you recognize, was the setup to some of the best online interactions an invader could potentially get in Soulsborne as an invader. Fight clubs would also be desirable again due to the increased player limit, and like I mentioned before, a route to PvP for players is only a good thing. With this increase, it would also make sense for Tanner's Tongue to function similarly to Dried Finger in that a host can enable a third cooperator with the risk of a second invader. Speaking of, if we continue with this hypothetical, why not allow Tanner's Tongue to enable a reward for using it, such as a rune arc upon an invader's defeat? Not only serving as a slight distinction from Dried Finger, but also progressing the mechanic to give it an extra incentive to use for the average player. It also goes without saying, but Tanner's Tongue should not be able to be turned off unless through defeat or loading back into an area. I do not know why the decision was made to allow a player to turn it off during a multiplayer session, but it was not the call. For solo players enabling Tanner's Tongue, if there were to be a change I do not believe would be detrimental, is to make solo hosts able to be invaded, but not at the extreme frequency it is set to for multiple cooperators. This way, the solo host enables the possibility of being invaded, but leave the surprise factor that invasions in the past would give that's not present in the game. If a hunter or cooperator arrives while the tongue is active, then this frequency is set back to being constant the way it is. Although, I personally would not be opposed to solo host invasions when they have their Great Rune on and are in a legacy dungeon, but I want to clarify that only if they allow blue summons to arrive close to, or at around the same time as an invader, so it will allow a host some help if caught in the middle of a level as to serve as a compromise. I know talking about solo host invasions is a mixed bag, so I'll just leave it at that. These reward and Tanner's Tongue changes, in combination of allowing great runes during multiplayer, would make it more appealing for players to use and reward their time for engaging with it. I also want to throw in the suggestion that Tanner's Tongue in the open world should only be able to be used at Sites of Grace and should disable Torrent's use, since if a host is looking for multiplayer interaction in the open world, Torrent's use is already infrequent due to automatically being disabled when not alone. But I suggest this so AFK rune farmers can't hide in the butt crack of the map with Torrent, turn on Tanner's Tongue where they are, and wait for invaders. Now, while this is one aspect of general multiplayer, let's look at what could bring more variety to online interactions. Covenants. This section is going to cover covenants and how they could work in the ecosystem of the online component of Elden Ring. I'm going to draw inspiration from the past games and propose similar functions since preferably a good idea is expanded upon and implemented rather than just being left behind. There's a lot of different factions and ideologies in the game that it would also be good to have a good chunk of covenants in the game. As an addition to covenants and their online function, I believe there's room for both familiar and additional aspects. As a basis, let's take a look at the Covenant graphic from earlier. On top of their online function, I want to propose their rewards and multiplayer items that could be offered and used. And before we do, there will be a PvE oriented approach to rank up in the Covenant that will be explained later on, but let's focus on the online aspect. Some rewards that could be desirable is of course armor, weapons, and spells like previous iterations. However, I believe armor dyes and weapon skin variants would be a good call as an incentive, but to also expand on the altered garment mechanic, as it is bizarre they usually only have one option despite having multiple slots. Instead of just removing a piece from the armor, altering stats, and calling it a day, these could be color alterations that don't change the weight or stats. It'd be beneficial to have a synergistic color palette so mixing armor is easier. That was a key part in matching armor together in the past, was due to them having a coherent palette of colors so you would not have so many different shades of steel, cloth, and the like that would cause jarring breaks in fashion. Additionally, this next suggestion is inspired by Dark Souls 2, as I really like the concept and think it could come back in a different form, that being weapon skin variants. Weapons in the game that have the same stats but only have a cosmetic difference. Of course, these would ideally be tame, like a different color on the blade or crossguard and what have you, and it doesn't necessarily have to be just that. It could add some addition like the Dark Souls 2's Great Club having blood on it. Something to make it more personal for players while keeping it grounded in the game. We don't want Call of Duty levels of absolute buffoonery, just something that's appealing for customization. Moving on to multiplayer items, I thought Phantom Bloody Fingers were a neat addition that allowed an extra tool in an invader's pocket. So to give a slight difference in gameplay between covenants, I want to propose giving each covenant their own type of item upon multiplayer interactions. For example, in this hypothetical, the Death Prince Servant Covenant would act similarly to Gravelord Covenant in that you will curse players' worlds with stronger phantom enemies, or if that is too ambitious, then buffed enemies, and the way a player can stop this is by finding the summon sign left behind by the servant and doing a reverse invasion to eliminate them. For Gravelording, you are alone and on your own. For Death Princing? To add a slight distinction, the Death Prince Servant gains an item that functions similarly to Bloody Phantom Finger, but for a host. So the servant could reposition themselves, since a theoretical 1v5 would definitely necessitate a retreat or repositioning, and this could provide that. When the host defeats an invading player, they gain an item that they can use to rank up in the Covenant. Then there could be the Frenzy Covenant, that could work similarly to Dark Souls 3 Mound Makers in being able to place a summon sign as a friendly or hostile summon, or invade as an enemy. In this case, their potential item could be different depending on how they enter the world. For instance, if summoned as an ally, they are the same as a regular cooperator and the rules apply to them, but using their specific item would enable themselves to become an enemy player, able to be targeted and fight the host in the party. Once activated, it can't be turned off in the session, and a frenzied cooperator could not activate it during a boss fight, so they can't just gank the host with the boss. They can complete the objective by either helping the host, defeating the host, or an amount of players in the session. I do think there should be an incentive for a host to consider summoning these players as allies, since there wasn't any for Mound Makers in Dark Souls 3. If invading or summon hostile, the frenzy player could use their unique item to temporarily enable friendly fire among the hosts in the party, ideally with low damage but able to stagger each other for a limited duration, meaning the frenzied invader could alleviate some of the blunder potential that the host in the party has, but they would need to make use of the limited duration that the item gives them. I think multiplayer items that add a slight twist is a fun change, but it could be another one of those things where it just sounds good on paper. Either way, I hope this gets you thinking of some variety covenants could add to multiplayer interactions. Getting away from multiplayer, I mentioned that there could be a PvE focused way to rank up in covenants, and while I'm not entirely opposed to having enemies drop the covenant related items, the Colosseum and Runark shop could be another route to obtaining these things. So the Colosseum has always struck me as a game edition that has a lot of potential for not only organized PvP, but also for PvE. As it is now, if you do not like PvP, then the Colosseum might as well not exist, because the only reason to engage with it is for the enjoyment of the PvP, possibility of 6-player matches, and spirit summon battles. I want to propose having a PvE mode in the Colosseum that offers another route to Runarks and other rewards if players do not want to participate in PvP. It could be something reminiscent to Sekiro's Gauntlet of Strength, but doesn't have to strictly be a boss rush mode. They could have fun with it and make it a gauntlet of levels where the player has to get through waves of enemies, and then the last wave is a remembrance boss. At the end of it, the player could gain rune arcs upon completing it, or whatever reward that would be desirable to a player. The two reasons why I would be for an iteration of this concept is that 1, this allows a method of obtaining rune arcs and items for players who don't want to engage with multiplayer, whether it be preference or a lack of experience. 2, players get to fight against remembrance bosses solo again without having to go to New Game Plus. Personally, I wish there was an in-game way to rematch major bosses solo to learn optimal play and punishes to feel like I mastered the boss and apply lessons learned to other major bosses without the large gaps of time between them. I think this could also curb some of the knee-jerk reactions a lot of people have when first fighting these bosses and calling them unfair by allowing players to engage with the boss as many times as they want without having to spend time going through the game again. For players hoping to gain items responsible for ranking up in the Covenant, the rune arcs gained could be sold to gain them through the rune arc shop. If a player wants to rank up in the Covenant, they have 3 ways to do so, being to participate in multiplayer, farming items from enemies, or trading rune arcs at the shop, which would make the process a bit more lax compared to previous iterations. Now, going back to the regular Colosseum with PvP, with the idea of a rune arc shop idea in mind, it would be a nice reward for players maybe after a certain amount of victories in a row to gain a rune arc. As for matchmaking, I'm sure there's opinions on what should be done, but if we're stuck with this iteration, we have an any option for the map, but personally I would like to see an any option for combat mode, and likewise similar settings for players who don't have a preference and just want to engage in a PvP activity no matter what it is, ideally to serve as a faster form of matchmaking with others. Now, I don't know if 2 or more players have to choose the any option in order to queue up together, or if one player can have the any option and the other has something else, but ideally for matchmaking's sake, that is how it should be. Having different arena options for 3 identical maps really only harms the experience by splintering the possibility of matchmaking. If we do not get new and different arenas, it would be more beneficial for matchmaking's sake to allow the game decide one of the 3 arenas we have and remove the option unless a password is used. In regards to spawning in invasions, ideally the vertical proximity would be taken into account, same as horizontal, but there's a couple of band-aid solutions that could alleviate the issue. For one, when an invader uses a phantom bloody finger, the invader cannot spawn in the same spawn point more than once unless there's no other relevant spawn. This way, an invader won't be stuck wasting bloody fingers spawning into the exact same spawn over and over. Alternatively, would there be such an issue for giving more phantom bloody fingers for invaders? It can be used to reposition an invader who's in a tight spot, which is useful, but primarily it'll be used for correcting a bad spawn. Additionally, in patch 1.12, FromSoft introduced a new feature for the player to enable or disable summoning pools in the map functions menu so they can choose the areas a player wanted the golden effigy to send their summon sign for co-op. That was a neat addition, but I'm certain I'm not alone in wishing that it applied to invading because then it would benefit everyone. Co-opers waiting outside of a boss room, summoning and buffing before entering would not have to worry about an invader intruding on them as often because I promise you, majority of invaders do not like invading before a boss fog because it's either going to end with the host party ending the session by going into the boss room, or it's the most vile gank experience Elden Ring can offer. Lastly, if there were an additional option for just prioritizing legacy dungeon-like areas, while not necessary, would be a nice option for players who don't particularly like the way open world invasions often are and the issues they present. While I have been critical about the multiplayer so far, I want to also note the good aspects as it's only fair. When giving some criticism, personally I believe it's important to point out the things that were done well, and while I may not realize or remember every good aspect, I want to mention some regardless. The best addition is definitely the near and far option for both invading and summoning. Granted, it took a while for the addition to arrive, and with how large the game is, definitely should have been there sooner, but the impact it has made is appreciated. It makes me step back and think of how invasions in general multiplayer used to be after launch without it, and I am glad it got implemented. Even in a non-open world layout, this would have been such an awesome addition in games of the past, and I hope is present in From Software's games for more consistent multiplayer going forward. You may or may not remember patch 1.07 added separate damage scaling and exclusive adjustments for PvP. With how strong the game allows players to get, having a system in place that adjusts things solely against another player was honestly an addition I was not expecting Elden Ring to receive. Now, how impactful it really has been could be debated, but the inclusion of it, I believe, is a net positive since this could very well be in future titles that have PvP. While it could be argued on how balanced the game is currently, I imagine it could be in a worse state if this addition was not added to the game. I don't know about you, but when I decide to invade, I want to play Elden Ring, not hide and seek. An addition I'm thankful that we have, especially with how big the game is the compass when invading. Specifically that it can be used to locate a host using the marker it has. It's one of those additions that I hope is present going forward, even if the next game isn't as huge as the open world in Elden Ring. It's also nice to determine if a player is griefing by rune farming, so you can determine if it's worth staying or severing out and moving on. While being a mixed bag, I want to include Phantom Bloody Fingers being a good addition since it can really come through sometimes and help an invader when dealing with bad spawns, or relocating to a hopefully advantageous position in the host world. Overall, I'm glad that we have it and hope we have a similar item or mechanic in future titles, but hope that it can be built further upon. Another addition I am glad we have is spawn immunity. Spawning into another player's world and being able to assess the situation and plan accordingly without fear of being blendered right out of the gate is very nice whenever the game decides to spawn you on top of a party. Like mentioned earlier, allowing the player to choose which summoning pools their sign can go to is great. If a player prefers or dislikes a set of locations for co-op, they can choose directly where they can be summoned. It's a nice quality of life addition, and while I do wish something similar was implemented for invasions, it is welcome. Elden Ring is a massive game that had to cover so many areas that required meticulous polish from gameplay, locations, lore, and much more. To expect every aspect to be a slam dunk is unrealistic, even for an incredible studio like From Software. However, just like I mentioned in the beginning, the multiplayer is a regression from previous titles. That's not to say that invasions in Elden Ring cannot be fun, do not get it twisted. If you love Elden Ring invasions and how they play, that is awesome and I am glad you can enjoy your time. The premise of invasions is already a great foundation of having fun interactions and scenarios. The reason why I and others may be critical for the online component of Elden Ring, whether it be invasions or not, is because we do care about the experience for ourselves and others. Some voice their criticism in different ways, both good and some could say brash, but at the end of the day, we all are playing the same game and want to see its full potential that we know it can achieve. With that said, I want to extend the conversation to you and ask for your thoughts on Elden Ring's invasions and multiplayer. Whether it be a comment or even a video response, I invite you to share. If we do not see eye to eye on aspects or you disagree with points in this video, that is okay. I would like to ask though, if Elden Ring received a God patch that included covenants, armor dyes or weapon skins, and increased player limit, would it make invasions and multiplayer better for you or interest you into playing again? Alternatively, if Elden Ring received a Scholar of the First Sin treatment and had all of these additions, would you buy it again? I'm interested in hearing the responses. Speaking personally, I do funnily enough still enjoy Elden Ring invasions, but believe me when I say, I understand how frustrating the game can be and do not fault anyone for not playing anymore. My only hope is that if not Elden Ring, then another future FromSoft game learns and implements the good design decisions we've come so far with and start progressing towards a brighter and better experience. With all of this said, I hope that you have a great day and hope to see you around. This has been Derpy. I'll see you guys later.